The world's attention is on South Africa as it gears up to host the 15th BRICS Summit, a pivotal gathering of 5 influential nations that could reshape the global order. This event has sparked unprecedented interest from countries across Asia, South America, the Middle East and Africa, all vying for a spot at the BRICS table. Set against the backdrop of a changing geopolitical and economic landscape, this gathering sets the stage for beginning important conversations whose outcomes may be felt beyond the global south. Under the theme BRICS in Africa, Partnership for Mutually Accelerated Growth, Sustainable Development and Inclusive Multilateralism, the spotlight is on the place and role of Africa within BRICS. So we ask, what exactly does this summit mean for Africa? Join us as we explore the key issues on the agenda, the likely outcomes, and how these could open a new chapter of collective growth and empowerment for Africa. I'm Penny Nakaribe. Welcome to Talk Africa. Let's now bring in our panel of experts. Joining in Johannesburg, Professor David Munyae, an international relations and foreign policy expert. In Ankara, Turkey, we have Ovigwe Egwegu, policy analyst at Development Reimagined. And in Cairo, Egypt, we have Randa Hamed, an economist and chairwoman of Okaz Trading. A very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us on Talk Africa. Now, the 15th BRICS Summit in Johannesburg has grabbed global attention like never before. Why is this summit so important? What is its significance? Professor Munyae, let me begin with you.
I think this seminar itself, the summit, differs from the rest because it's taking place at the backdrop of the conflict in Ukraine, as well as the tension among and between the bigger powers and other issues that are affecting global order, such as climate change. And due to all of the above, a number of emerging countries are also demanding to, requesting to join BRICS. And they also talk of the de-dollarization, a number of issues that signals a changing world order to a much more multipolar world.
Ovigwe, coming to you, why is this BRICS summit so important?
It's a very crucial summit, perhaps the most important summit of BRICS we've seen since the formation started. We really are at a crossroad in terms of global geopolitics and systemic transition. And we see this play out in several domains, whether it's the economic sphere. People are talking about the need to shift from reliance on the dollar to trading in local currencies. We see that also in terms of tackling inflation and looking for economic growth, and also in the security sphere with issues around Ukraine conflict. And issues also regarding great power tension more broadly. So from all of these three perspectives, these summits being a summit where some of the biggest powers in the world and the emerging markets are participating either as members or aspiring members, it means that the summit holds a lot of promise in terms of providing global solutions to these issues.
Right, and speaking of global solutions, globally, post-COVID recovery has been slow. And we also have the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which has sent the cost of living skyrocketing. But even more importantly, the build-up to this summit has been characterized by geopolitical contests here in Africa. Professor Munyae, looked at together, how do all this make this year's BRICS summit something to look forward to for Africa?
I think for Africa, this is a golden opportunity. They will be building upon the Africa Agenda 2063, the need to speed the process of integration through connectivity, issues of infrastructure development, requiring massive injections of investments, funding of this infrastructure. Climate change, which we have mentioned, is directly affecting the continent, even though the continent hasn't been responsible for the destruction of the environment. It's mainly the developed countries. And we also are seeing that the continent hasn't been getting a fair share of representation in key and strategic institutions of global governance, such as United Nations, particularly the Security Council, and all other UN agencies. Africa is not represented well. With 1.3 billion people, to consolidate and have a coherent, a strategic, well-coordinated voice, I think BRICS for Africa becomes a great platform to ensure that we head at a global level, and therefore BRICS is critical for the continent.
Right. Randa, do you agree? I mean, looking at BRICS and where it's happening in Africa, being hosted by the only African member of BRICS, what's there for Africa to get excited about?
You know, we're too big to neglect, because the BRICS itself, the economy, it contributes around 31.5% of the global GDP, whereas G7 contribute around 30%. And the BRICS countries, they contribute 40% of the world population. So I believe we're too big to neglect, and we were not heard before, either in G7 summits or by the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, or all institutions that are UN related. We haven't been heard. So I think this is an excellent platform summit to get the African countries and to unleash their potential. We have a lot of potential, and I think it just needs coordination, and we need to get together, get our voice heard, and that should reflect on the economic growth of the continent and the countries, of course, in the continent.
Right. So the theme of the 15th BRICS Summit, which gets underway shortly in South Africa, is BRICS and Africa, partnership for mutually accelerated growth, sustainable development, and inclusive multilateralism. Ovig, we're coming to you. What is your understanding and interpretation of this theme, and why is it relevant for Africa?
The fact that BRICS and the theme of this year's BRICS talks about mutually accelerated growth, not just accelerating growth, because it has to be mutual. We are in an interconnected world, and that is very relevant. For African countries, for instance, slowdown in Asia could mean a slowdown for African countries, because they are primary commodity exporters, and those factories and industries that that import their commodities may reduce their demand because of the slowdown globally. So it's very key that the summit is looking at growth from a mutually beneficial perspective. And then secondly, sustainable development, because that is still a very important issue, particularly in regards to climate and all of the associated problems that comes with it. The lack of delivery and fulfillment of promises made in the last two COPs. And for African countries that are the front line, this is a very crucial issue. And then finally, inclusive multilateralism. That is, in my opinion, by far one of the major challenges that the world is facing today, in the sense that nobody can really say the world is really able to solve any problem. It wasn't able to solve COVID in a very decisive way. Currently, we're looking at the global food crisis, and still yet there's a leadership failure in established institutions. So it is very important that new and emerging formations like BRICS take on that responsibility to make the world more united, more inclusive, rather than exclusive clubs that lock out other parties.
Right. So speaking of inclusivity, some 67 leaders from Africa and other regions in the Global South will be at this year's summit. Professor Munyai, this reflects the commitment to multilateralism and cooperation among emerging economies and developing nations. What mechanism is in place to ensure there is harmony in the disparate ideas and proposals they bring to this summit?
I think if you look at it, you see that a number of countries from different regions will come with their own comparative advantage, not just in the numbers in terms of their population, but economic activities, what they produce in that specific regions. And therefore, BRICS is becoming more and more representative of the entire world. It's a question of moving with everyone and ensure that you inject all different cultures, different civilization, and find best solution coming from all over the world in resolving the crisis that we confront at the global level. Currently, we have hegemonic powers that preach on what the world should be and how they go about doing it without necessarily listening to the others. And therefore, I think BRICS will start opening this conversation for reform of these institutions at a global level. And it is informed by ideas of Bandung in 1955 in Indonesia. Asian leaders and African leaders met and they discussed how best to cooperate and take advantage to close the gap, technological gap between developed countries and developing, cooperation on culture, and dealing with issues that are controversial, such as racism and different way of bringing a harmonious world. I think that's what BRICS is bringing on board.
Right. Now, this year's BRICS summit has sparked huge interest from countries across Asia, South America, the Middle East, and even here in Africa. Randa, coming to you, Egypt is one of the African countries that have expressed interest in joining BRICS. Why does Egypt want to join BRICS?
Okay, Egypt has been, like a lot of the other countries, struggling with high inflation and foreign exchange, currency shortage of foreign exchange, and all that because, of course, the war in Ukraine, and we had a lot of outflow of foreign currency. So we're hoping that by joining the BRICS, we will secure more FDIs, we will build on our foreign reserves, and we will also be able to develop ties with potentially able to open new trading partners and maybe integrate to the world economy. We will feel that we might gain more voice and bargaining power in on international issues. We will be positioning ourselves and maybe getting more trade, which is essential for securing the foreign currency, foreign exchange, which has been really, which we have been really struggling with since the war in Ukraine. Because, of course, we're one of the nations where our trade balance is always in a deficit. And so we're hoping to find new channels and more business opportunities. And of course, that will reflect on the economic growth and on the, of course, the per capita income and on the people on the street, that they feel the progress in the economy.
Okay, Professor Munyaya, coming to you, which other African countries have formally applied to join BRICS members, and what do you see them bringing on board?
I think they'll bring so much. Egypt is rich when it comes to African civilization in terms of its own culture. It specializes in a number of areas. It's also building a new city, energy sector, education. I think cooperation with other countries is quite rich. And if you look at the AU's Agenda 2063, there is this wish by Africans to have a corridor from Cape Town here in South Africa to Cairo. And I think opening that, I think within BRICS, broader BRICS, you are broadening alternative investments in terms of injections in this wish list of Africans in terms of their infrastructure. You'll take advantage of Brazil, take advantage of Russia as well as India and the giant China itself in a coordinated way, also with the developed countries, Western world. So it's a way in international relation, we call that back wagoning, taking advantage of the giants. And therefore, if you look, Algeria is similar, it's quite important. Population-wise, Ethiopia, more than 100 million people. Nigeria is the giant on the continent. So put together, I think all these African countries will have more to contribute within BRICS, as well as move with the rest of the continent. We don't want to leave anyone behind. And what we see happening within BRICS is really to avoid the contradictions that are at a global level. We're criticizing Western countries of being too elitist, and therefore within the global south, we also have to avoid having BRICS countries very elitist and leaving the rest of the global south behind.
All right. On that note, let's take a short break, and when we come back, we will continue our discussions on the upcoming BRICS summit. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me in Johannesburg, we have Professor David Munyai, an international relations and foreign policy expert. In Ankara, we have Ovigwe Egwegu, a policy analyst at Development Reimagined. And in Cairo, we have Randa Hamed, an economist and chairwoman of Okas Trading. Right, so it looks inevitable that BRICS will have to expand to accommodate countries expressing interest to join the bloc. Ovigwe, coming to you, does BRICS have the criteria for admitting new members? And if not, what sort of criteria do you have in mind? A criteria that encourages inclusion as opposed to exclusion?
There really are several issues to consider. One of them is if the bloc, if the formation really wants to transform itself into a membership organization, and in that way, some arguments I've put out in regards to what the criteria should be, whether countries should, whether we should have the format like the SCO, where there's an observer status given, and then there's their partnership members before you become a full member of BRICS. But overall, whatever the modality would be in terms of the process, I think the criteria has to be. We have to go back to the original intention that led to BRICS in the first place. The fact that there are some issues regarding the current structure or global economic structure in particular that is unfavorable to emerging countries and emerging economies. And to overturn the system, you have to create a better system through political and security cooperation, economic collaboration, standard setting in current, present and new areas of economies and technologies and all of these issues. So one of the main factors I think needs to be considered has to be a revisionist mindset. Because if a country wants to it works with business as usual or the status quo, then its membership in BRICS is largely useless because we need to see that transformational idea in the states. So and all the members that want to participate. I think that would be very, very crucial as a starter when you're looking at what the criteria would be going forward.
Right. Professor Munyai, what do you think of that?
Firstly, it's a question of avoiding your Western world rhetorics of democracies and authoritarian countries, dividing the world in a very simplistic way. I think the criteria has to do more of developmental BRICS, a people-centered BRICS that consider that the whole world must develop, and therefore we need to ensure that they are involved in matters of global governance. It's important. On issues of climate, all countries are ahead, and justice in the world is required, that we all cannot develop at the same pace, given the advantage that the Western world has had. And therefore, transforming these institutions that are critical to our well-being, the World Health Organization, it has to change the manner in which it responds to crises of pandemic and the lessons that we learned throughout the COVID-19. And these are issues, so food security, the future crisis of future security is required. And Africa has more to offer with 60% of global arable land. I think we have more. Instead of crying over Ukraine crisis and issues of grain, we have more to offer to the world. So I think BRICS will have that. And lastly, opening up to new issues, digital. How do we govern? What kind of rules and regulation? These rules and regulations should not be dictated upon the developing country by the West. They need to be that democracy from below. And therefore, BRICS, I think, is the best platform to start bringing these new members with that in mind.
Right, and I think just looking at the very foundations of the BRICS, as Ovigwe mentioned, it fosters principles like mutual respect, equality and inclusiveness, differentiating it from other global economic blocs. So Randa, coming to you, how has inequality in global trade relations hurt Africa, and how do you see BRICS fixing these disparities?
The inequality, of course, we can see that because, as I mentioned, it's the BRICS, they are big in terms of the contribution to world GDP and in terms of population. But when it comes to our voice being heard in international summits, we found ourselves we were not heard. So we really need to make sure that this time we can come forward together, especially now that the focus is the summit, the focus of BRICS is BRICS and Africa. African nations, they need to get together. I feel, first of all, they need to make sure that to benefit from this summit, that the countries, they need to make sure that they work on their regulatory framework to be fair and sustainable. They need to make sure that our tax system, they have been maybe at a disadvantage because they have an inequitable tax system. They are vulnerable to external shocks. They have no buffers. They're social and political. They have social political corruption. A lot of these countries that are joining have some difficulty with the social political corruption. They face poor health and maybe education system, which of course hinders the workforce and the development. They have poor infrastructure and connectivity. So in these terms, we feel there is a disadvantage, and this is where we can get together as African nations through BRICS and maybe come forward and improve that, get more access to the world and get heard. Of course, we're more vulnerable to climate change because usually these countries, maybe they don't have the buffers to protect them from the climate change. It's about time that the BRIC countries together with the African countries have a say and have a lead, just like the G7. They have a say in world issues, and regarding climate change, sustainable development. A lot of the BRIC countries and Africa, they are very rich in minerals and resources, and I'm sure that with this summit, concentrating on Africa, we can unleash a lot of potential for these economies to grow even more.
Okay, so speaking in one voice, let's talk about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is up and running. And some reports suggest that it has already pushed intra-Africa trade from a paltry 12% to just about 30% within the short time it's been in operation. Ovigwe, coming to you, what does an expanded BRICS mean for the Africa Continental Free Trade Area? And how does it change the dynamics? And also, is there reason to worry?
If we look at the AFCFTA in terms of its implementation, I think to a large extent it's not as fast as we would like to see. But that, in my perspective, has to do with some of the technicalities around really issues like payment, for instance. And the issue of payment is one of the topics on the table, in the upcoming BRICS summit. So when we're talking about how to really move forward, I think in terms of the issue of trade, AFCFTA and BRICS, I think the technical the tools and the instruments of trade settlement can really be provided, or at least been strengthened, through the BRICS system, because these are emerging economies themselves, of those really strong in terms of economy, in terms of finance, in terms of trade opportunities, with African countries. So from that perspective, I think there is a lot of promise with regards to the BRICS summit.
All right. So to wind up this discussion, I would like to hear from all of you, your expectations for the upcoming BRICS summit, particularly in terms of its likely impact on Africa going forward. Randa, I'll begin with you.
I believe this summit, of course, is very important, and I just want to hope that the countries, to benefit from this, they have to make sure that they, just as my colleague said, we need to improve on a lot of things in our country itself, in Africa, to make sure we can, for example, the value added of the minerals and of the products that we produce. We need to ensure that we have the regulatory framework to ensure that business is easy to do in the country. We need a flexible exchange rate. We need to enhance and upgrade our infrastructure, and of course improve the technicalities and the skills of the workforce. So if we can do all that and benefit from this, I'm sure the countries can progress and grow, and hence enjoy an economic growth.
All right. Ovig, we're coming to you. What are your expectations?
Based on what we have read on the agenda, issues around discussing common payment system, deepening use of local currencies, and also expansion of the bloc, I see this as low-hanging fruit, particularly designing what the criteria is, what the formation or BRICS is going to look like in the future, because that will really give a lot of confidence to aspiring members, and also the issue of really laying really clearly how it intends to deepen economic collaboration among itself and create the instruments that will facilitate trade within the bloc, and of course in a way that benefits the global south. BRICS, like I've described in some articles, is a middle power magnet. It really enjoys a lot of attention from emerging countries, and to make that attention what it has to deliver on some of the most pressing issues on the economic sphere, in the financial sphere, and more broadly on political and other issues.
Right. And finally, Professor Munyai?
I'm excited about the development of digital currencies, and perhaps the African continent will take advantage to leapfrog into digital currency and to enable trade and avoid usage of other currencies that comes with punitive sanctions. At times it comes at a disadvantage of the continent. When we trade among ourselves, even on the African continent, there is a need to prioritize our own currencies and ensure that our own currencies also grow and work with in other bigger emerging countries to diversify the global currencies in the global currency basket. And therefore the yuan and Indian currency, Russian currency, Brazilian and others will be quite important, I think, in our own trade. And therefore I think BRICS might start to have conversation around these issues in a way of transforming the way we trade.
All right, and that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A very big thank you to our panel of experts in Johannesburg, Professor David Munyai, an international relations and foreign policy expert. In Ankara, Ovigwe Egwegu, a policy analyst at Development Reimagined. And in Cairo, Randa Hamed, an economist and chairwoman of Oka's Trading. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter. And you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more of Talk Africa. From me, Penina Karibe, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, goodbye.